Process costing. What is process costing? How is it different from job costing? What does it mean to process costs? Well, when you're talking about job costing, you're talking about very much units that are very different and very distinct, very unique. In a process costing, you're talking about we're creating, or in this case, manufacturing a homogeneous product. Frosted Flakes, cookie bars, potato chips, packaged foods. Those kind of things are more homogeneous. The same old thing, the same process goes over and over and over again, and at the end we're going to produce potato chips. At the end we're going to produce Frosted Flakes or some other type of food item. It's most certainly going to be isolated to a manufacturing environment. So that's the difference. A job is a very, very unique, very, very specific to a client. A process is homogeneous. The process goes all the way through from beginning to end. If you're making a cake, you're going to make a cake, start with the mixing, starting with the baking, starting with the packaging, and then off to your client. So a process means continuous motion. There's nothing customized about it. It's very, very homogeneous. It's the same old thing. Things are done by batches, pretty much. So when we're dealing with that, also the other difference I would note would be job costs would be most certainly I'm working with a client. I am a lawyer, and every single client would be a new job. Or I am a CPA, for example, and every single client is a new job. It's unique to that particular client, and it's not to be compared. Even though I'm providing legal services, the specifics of the job that I'm doing is very, very unique, and that's very different from process costing. So that's the first thing. Know the difference between the two and understand what they both provide to clients and how they're relevant. So when we're dealing with job costing, we have as a job, or in this case, an audit job, and then we've completed that job. But when we're talking about a process costing, we're talking about manufacturing, and it's most certainly in the production of something that can be used, eaten by a client. Manufacturing of a motor vehicle, manufacturing of an airplane, manufacturing of Frosted Flakes, manufacturing of some type of colas or other type of beverages. They require process. Why? Because the process by which you make your cereal will not vary at all. I mean, it's going to be cereal and cereal. You may add different ingredients and various levels of ingredients in that particular process, but it's essentially the same. You're going to mix it. You're going to combine your ingredients. You take all your raw materials, you combine them together. You're going to mix them. You're going to bake, or in some way bake, fry, or freeze, and then you're going to package, which is going to be the finishing part of it, and then you're going to distribute to the stores for sale. So understanding that we're dealing more with a manufacturing, we're dealing more with homogeneous products, not heterogeneous products. We're dealing with products that are just alike. We're dealing with products that are very much alike. We're dealing with products that we will be manufacturing in a process, not in a finished goods type of thing where I do a job for a client, which is very unique to each and every client. Every job is different. Every job has its nuances, and it's not the same, but this is very different from the process. So know the difference. So now, when we're dealing with our jobs that are our processes, we cannot, if you think about it, tell at any one point in time, because the nature of process accounting is continuous, right? You're continuously manufacturing cereal, for example. They may very well say, we create 55 batches a day. We create 100 batches a day. And all those batches, the same process is repeated over and over again. Again, process accounting. But in the mid part of that process, we want to be able to get an idea of what our completed goods, our completed process is, or our completed items, our units. If we are dealing with processes that go from one step to the next step to the next step to the next step until it's done, how can we determine what's actually finished? Well, equivalent units will be able to allow you to measure the amount of work that's been done up to the point where you're ready to count, up to the point where you're actually complete. Now, all the work is not necessarily done, but we want to be able to take a snapshot and measure what is done. up to the point where we're not done. So if we are 60% done in 5 of the different processes, we can add that all together and then say, okay, of our materials, we are 60% complete of putting together our materials. Assembly, I mean, again, if you're talking about a manufacturing process, you might not be baking anything. You might be, quite frankly, assembling something. And we're 60% on the assembly side. So I'm creating this motor vehicle. I gave you an example of baking a pie or baking cereal, that type of thing. But what if we're in the process of assembling a motor vehicle, and it takes an entire 10 days from the start to finish to manufacture 10 vehicles? So and we're not going to be segregating one vehicle from the next, because they're all the same. They're all cars. They're all the same model, the same brand, the same process. So the management says, well, can you tell me at the end of this process, can you tell me how many units are we done? Well, we're 60% complete with the assembly process. And then we are 40% complete of the framing process. And we are 50% in the installation of the engine and the transmission. And we are 20% complete of this. Each one of these processes will ultimately lead to a motor vehicle that will be driven out to a car dealership and sold. So at the end of the day, if you don't know, if you can't calculate all of the units to be completed because they're not all done, they're in various stages of completion, you can use equivalent units to measure what work has been done and count and essentially count how many units have been completed, unit based on how much done in each and every process. So, so what we're going to be going through in this chapter is measuring how can we determine the equivalent units of direct materials, the equivalent units of direct labor, and the equivalent units of overhead. Why? Because all those costs together gives us a cost per asset. In this case, we want to have all the materials that we had to cost in the equivalent form, how much it costs us to create this in terms of materials, how much people, how much cost and labor costs for this particular unit, and how much per unit is overhead. So we'll get a per unit cost for each and every item that we're going to manufacture. So equivalent units become quite important when you're trying to get an idea of how much it's cost you as you're processing and manufacturing this product. So what I would like for you to do in this chapter is read through, understand what is process costing, how is it different from job costing, and what is the role of equivalent units, and then finally how to process cost using the 5 steps. Step 1, count for all your units. You need to have an accounting of all your units. 2, an estimate of what is complete. Step by step by step, meaning materials, labor, and overhead. Then, how many units you have to account for. And again, using the work in process accounts for direct materials, etc., you need to accumulate the cost because you need to know how much costs right now that you need to account for. And then you have sufficient information to calculate your equivalent units. And again, your total account for your direct materials, you divide it by your equivalent units for direct materials, and that will give you your cost per equivalent unit for direct materials. So the calculation is extremely straightforward. I suggest using your book to keep you looking at the process and at the calculations, but more importantly, understand what this process is actually giving you and how to use it for decision making. So as you go through the chapter, take your time, remember the purpose of the chapter, remember the differences between processing job, understand the role of equivalent units, and how to determine the units to account for, which will ultimately allow you to calculate the cost per equivalent units for direct materials, direct labor, and for overhead. Thank you so much for this brief time together. You will be hearing from me very, very soon, and if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask.